Good morning, Rio. My name is Sam Kastensmidt, and I am the pastor of education here at Rio. And we are continuing in our Next Generation series, Next Gen, talking about some of the struggles that are unique to the generations that are launching out into the world right now, including the millennials and Gen Z, and some of the unique challenges that they're facing, including this wave of mental and emotional health crises that are coming. And so this week, as I was preparing for my message, I started looking at a lot of these different emotional and mental health conditions. And as a hypochondriac, I think I have 80% of them. I'm pretty convinced that I have them. And so we are continuing, and I say all that to kid a little bit, but the reality is, the fact that I'm reading it going, wait a minute, that sounds a lot like me, suggests that this isn't just a problem that's unique to the generations that are coming up and launching into the world. These are conditions that are prevalent to every generation, including Gen X and baby boomers and the silent generation. All of humanity struggles with these things, but what we're pointing out and examining right now is why it seems like there is gasoline poured on these problems and they are exploding to dimensions that we've never seen before, to record levels. And so we started the series with Will, who's 29. We went to Eric last week, who's 32. Now we're at me, 45, so we're moving in order. And next week, Tom will be here to represent the classics. You're welcome, Tom. But I want to start with a verse, and I want you to see if you can pick up the theme of this verse. It comes from 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 5 and 6. Listen to this, because Peter is talking to the next generation. You pick that up when he says, young men. Young men, in the same way, be submissive to those who are older. What is he calling them to do? Humble yourself beneath those that are older than you, your elders. And then he says, all of you, clothe yourselves with humility toward one another. So humble yourself to your elders. Humble yourself, clothe yourself in humility toward one another. And then he gives the reason statement, because God opposes the proud. Well, I don't want God being opposed to me. So let's not be proud. But then he says, and get this, God gives grace to the humble. So, humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that he, this is important, that he may lift you up in due time. And I don't know if you caught this, but what this passage is inviting you to see is humble yourself. Humble yourself to your elders. Humble yourself to those that are in your same generation, those that are among you. Humble yourself beneath God's mighty arm and let him be the one who lifts you up. That is really, really profound. There is a hope that comes when you put your faith and your trust in the Lord and you say, I'm going to humble myself in all these circumstances, and I'm not going to need to boast, and I'm not going to need the world to know that I'm the greatest, and I'm not going to charge my case and sit and try to make the world realize that I'm the greatest. I'm going to humble myself, and I'm going to let God be the one who lifts me up. There's freedom in that. You know, you go to the scriptures, and I will tell you that the scriptures, I don't think there's anything that is better at humbling mankind than God's word, because it really comes and puts us in our place. Undeniably. Let me just give you some examples of what the scripture has to say to Sam and to you. The heart is desperately wicked. Do you believe that? Do you believe that your heart, will, on one side or the other, your heart comes to you and says, you're no good. You don't measure up. You don't even live up to your own standards. They're always thinking about you. All those people, they're talking about you. You're no good, you're no good, you're no good. Or your heart goes to the other direction and says, I'm better than everyone else. I got this figured out. I'm the best. I'm entitled. I deserve. And the scriptures come and say, watch out because your heart is deceitful above all else. You better watch the arrows that it's throwing at your mind. Or Paul in the Old, and also in the Psalms, like you get lines like, there is no one righteous. And then adding, just in case you missed it, no, not one. Anybody in here righteous? Take it up with Paul. Isaiah comes and says, your best deeds in the presence of a holy God are like filthy rags. It would be absurd to stand in front of God being like, you know who I am. Like, you're really lucky to have me on your team, God. Like, that's absurd. And probably the greatest reality of truth that comes and puts us in our place in the Christian faith is that we are so broken in our sin that God had to die on a cross to atone for our sin. In other words, your redemption is a God-sized project. You required the death of God to be redeemed. Are you humbled yet? And that would be a real bummer if I said, all right, now go in peace, right? But here's the other side of that. The Bible comes and says that you are so precious to God that He adopts you as His sons and daughters. You are so precious to God that the Word comes again and again, and you know what it calls you? You are His treasured possession. Of all things in existence, He looks at you and says, you are my treasured possession. For God so loved the world that He gave His only Son. And so while we're so broken that we required the death of God, the good news is that God so loves you, He finds you worthy of the death of God. And wow, humble yourselves under the mighty arm of God and let Him lift you up. Let Him tell you what your value is. Because if you walk around going, I think I'm pretty valuable, what is that next to the infinite God who looks at you and says, you're worth the life of my Son. There's no estimation this world has to offer you that can compete with that. And yet it drives you to humility. And so what has this generation been presented? Because it's not this hope that no matter what may come, God is going to lift you up. See, we took a turn as a society, that the ethics of our society took a radical, sharp turn into atheism in the middle of the 1900s. And it was like the schools began from a premise that there's no God. We removed prayer out. We removed Bible out. We removed any discussions of greater things, metaphysical things. And we replace them with a philosophy that tells kids there's nothing beyond this material world. John Dewey, let me read a quote from him. He writes this in Teacher's Magazine, by the way. He is the father of modern American education. That's his title. He was the honorary lifetime president of the National Education Association. And he says, there is no God. There is no soul, hence there is no need for the props of traditional religion. Nature has no end, no aim, no purpose. There is change only. And so let me tell you the ethic that took over the education of our youth. You are not special. You are not made in the image of God. There is no spark of the divine in you because there is no God. You weren't created for a purpose. You're not commissioned for a purpose. And oh, by the way, there is no end. There's no day you're going to show up at the pearly gates with God clothing you in His righteousness and welcoming you in. Your beginning has no meaning. Your end has no meaning. So guess what is true about all the days in between? There is no meaning. There's no purpose. There is change only. Okay, generations, good luck with that. I wonder why they have mental and anxiety issues. And eternal hope has now been shrunk down to 70 or 80 or maybe 90 years where they've got one shot at utopia. And therefore, every intruding failure is crushing to their identity. There's no hope of redemption. This is what we have foisted upon this generation. There's no hope outside of this ever-shifting, ever-changing material world. You get one shot. Would that stress you out? I think I'd be pretty stressed out. And so if there is no God to lift you up, what do? Well, fast forward a little bit and you get another atheist, a guy by the name of Nathaniel Branden, who says, self-esteem. That's the answer. So he writes The Psychology of Self-Esteem, and so the answer is, if they don't have God's esteem and they don't have anything that makes them feel value innately, let's make them feel valuable by having them puff themselves up. And so you see a generation that comes with the pressure to make sure that they themselves are valuable. And all of society circles around them to make sure, oh my goodness, we can't ever let them see that they're failing or that they're flawed or that they're broken or that there's anything wrong with them. And you see articles like this: school bans teachers from using red ink because it's too mean. Oh, red ink. Oh. And you see the trophy generation, right? And it no longer is the truth of God calling upon us to recognize our shortcomings and humbling us and restraining our egos. No. Now we give praise for everything. We tell generations that they are the center of the universe, that they can do anything they set their minds to. Let me just get to brass tacks. We lied to them. And they believed us. And so you get to modern day and they're finding that this self-esteem movement has utterly blown up and been disastrous. And you go to millennials and they find in early 2010s that 70% of millennials believed they ranked in the top 20% of performers in their jobs. Take a moment and do the math. 70% think they're in the top 20%. That means there's more of them in the bottom half that think they're in the top 20% than are in the top 20%. And this was devastating. And parents, we ran right behind all this and says, no, my daughter can never fail. I have to protect them from everything. And so what do you see? You see, oh my goodness, you woke up and dressed yourself. You deserve a trophy and balloons and cake. Hooray! And the helicopter parents and the hover parents and the snowplow parents and oh my goodness, I've got to protect my child from any possible obstacle that could cause them to recognize that they're not amazing, that could allow them to fail, that could teach them resiliency. I'm going to praise them to where they think they are number one at all things. And what have we done to this generation in the process? They've lost an opportunity to learn grit. They've lost their ability to be resilient, to be bold, to explore. They never learned how to fail. And I know what that's like. I'm a dad, I get this. I remember when my son Caleb was 4 years old. He was an absolute diehard fanatic about Toy Story. And so he had all the toys. He had Woody and Buzz and Bullseye and the whole set, the whole cast and crew, and he loved them. And one day, Laura took them to the beach, and he was going down in the sand, dragging the wagon. I don't know why you bring a wagon to the beach. That just sounds like torture. But anyway, he's dragging the wagon to the beach, and Laura tells Caleb, do not take the toys down by the water. And what does Caleb do? I'm 4. Of course I'm smarter than Mom. And so he takes his toys down, and before you know it, the water comes in, and bullseye goes out. And man, so they get home, and when I tell you that heart-tugging grief had overwhelmed Caleb, I mean, he's crying. He loves bullseye. Like, that was his favorite one, and the bullseye is gone. And so as a dad of a 4-year-old, my first son, I don't know what to do, but I don't like watching him cry, and I love him to pieces. So I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, I'm going to go get a bullseye. I'm going to find a bullseye. So I travel all over Fort Lauderdale to try to get a bullseye, ultimately go into Target, and I see that they've got a Toy Story section, but they don't sell the individuals. They only sell the big cast and crew. So I'm like, well, I only need the one, but I really love my kid and I want to be a good dad, so I buy the whole set. And I come home and I set everything up, and I wrote this big elaborate thing and videotaped the whole thing. And I'm like, Caleb, come look at what's in the door. And he opens it up, and you see this is the picture that we took, and you can see all the cast and crew on the floor. Bullseye! Like, just pure joy. And it was awesome as a dad. Awesome. And he ran and played with those things, and before the end of the week, bullseye was lost again. And I remember having this conversation, like, if I lost my toys, my dad, who is right here in the front row, who asked me not to point him out, he said if I pointed him out, he was going to tell stories about me from childhood. I don't care. Bring it. My identity is in Jesus, Dad. So, by the way, congratulations to them. They are newlyweds 2 weeks ago. So pretty amazing. But I was thinking to myself, like, if I lost bullseye, my dad would have never gone to the store and bought me all these toys. What am I doing? Like, he would have waited for a birthday or a Christmas. And I thought to myself, like, especially after Caleb lost bullseye again, like, I've just robbed him of an opportunity to learn to take care of his stuff. And the reality was I did that more for me than to take the role of a father who's really training his son up to become a better person. And that may sound harsh, like a lot of people are like, oh, I'm glad I'm not his kid. But that's the reality. You know, our job as parents is to remind them that we love them and to be a safe place where they can always come back, but it's not to protect them from every failure. We actually wreck their lives when we do that. And so we produce a generation that's been told and led to believe that they're right their whole life, and they're devastated when the world disagrees. This was 1960. Remember that? Like, you got an F, man, you heard from your parents. Nowadays, as a former headmaster, I can attest to this. Now you get an F, and the parents are like, how dare you tell me that my child is failing? So rather than coming alongside of them and being like, hey, let's walk through how to fail, how to improve, let's learn resiliency and grit together, you've got parents enabling their kids to think they're the center of the universe. And oh, by the way, what does that do to the kid? Hey, you're not allowed to fail. You're better than failure. So what happens in the mind of that kid is they believe, if I fail, is my love in jeopardy? Like, is this my whole identity, that I'm not allowed to fail, that you come along and react like this when I do? Like, you've been telling me I'm the best in the world at everything, and now I don't have freedom to not be the best. Try walking under those weights. And just because I love despair.com and I think this is a good comedic break, self-esteem, I love this. Just because you think you're a star doesn't mean you're going anywhere. You got to check this website out. It's wonderful. Individuality. Always remember that you're unique, just like everyone else. And the Bible comes and it has an antidote for this. You know, we have so foisted all this on to kids that no longer know how to fail. They don't know how to process it. They've been told they're the best their whole lives. Like, Paul comes, and he's somebody who knows this well because he used to be a Pharisee. And who were the Pharisees? The Pharisees were the people who kept all the rules, who had the appearance and put on the robes and the tassels, and everybody was like, ooh, a Pharisee, he must be really good. And he walks around his whole adult life having to measure up and having to put on the mask and having to fool everybody that he's really got it all together, when inside, like all of other humanity, he knows he doesn't. He knows he's messy. He knows he's a fraud. Until Jesus meets him and says, hey, I know you're a fraud. And I know you're messy. And you're worth my life. Be free of the need to prove yourself to a world. Be mine. And Paul falls in love with the gospel and gives his life to Christ. And he writes things like this to us. It's for by the grace that was given to me, like I've experienced it, I know what I'm talking about. I say to every one of you, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment in accordance with the measure of faith God has given you. Stop trying to prove to the world that you're the greatest. You are not. And that's okay. Jesus teaches things like this. Brilliant advice, actually. In Luke chapter 14, Jesus says, when someone invites you to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honor. For a person more distinguished than you may have been invited, and if so, the host who invited both of you is going to come to you and say, give this man your seat, and then humiliated, you will have to take the least important place. And so let me just take that instruction and apply it to an entire couple of generations that have been taught, you deserve the seat of honor, take the seat of honor, you're number one, you're the best, you. And then life comes along and wakes you up and says, you're in the wrong seat. And a whole generation goes, but my whole identity is that seat. And life says, tough. And they're crushed. So the question is it loving to tell them you deserve the seat of honor always? No, it's not. And we see how this plays out with the statistics of young girls and boys who feel sad or hopeless and increase dramatic growth. We see suicide rates that are reaching records, especially for young girls. We see, and Will mentioned this, or Eric mentioned this last week, these studies that find that 8th, 10th, and 12th graders, I can't do anything right. Well, what does that mean? Like they're sitting around evaluating themselves on how everyone else sees them. I can't do anything right. It's too crushing. My life is not useful. I don't enjoy life. Well, if that was what I had to live up to all the time, I'm not sure I would either. And the Reality 2013 report, all these studies being done on self-esteem, and they're like, this is a disaster. A 2013 report found that college students whose parents had been overly involved in their social lives had, quote, significantly higher levels of depression and less satisfaction with life. In other words, parents with the best of intentions are like, I'm going to engineer your social life, and I'm going to get you with the good friends, I'm going to make sure you make the baseball team, and you're in the highest honors class, and I'm going to go and I'm going to engineer your whole life for you so that, and you never learn how to do any of this stuff, and surprised when you go to college or when you go out into the workforce and it's not there for you, and you find out, I'm really not all those things that I always had been when I was at home. Gutted. I had to keep this picture in for this study just because it's amazing. Like that guy does not deserve a selfie, right? Can we agree? I'm kidding. Of course he does. It's glorious. But a 2015 study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences revealed that children aged 7 to 12 who receive excessive and superfluous praise just for everything, that they develop significantly higher rates of narcissism and superiority issues. Have you noticed a shift in superiority issues in our culture where people can't disagree and the whole world has to agree with me because I am the source of all truth, and if you disagree with me, I'll destroy you? Has anybody noticed any increase in superiority problems? Yeah. So there was a study recently, I love this, and it's funny to me, even though it's tragic. 46%, listen to this, 46% of Americans believe that they are the best person they know. Think on that for a moment. 46% of people think I am the best person I know. That means this half is all going, I, as an individual, am better than everyone else in here. Like mathematically, there's problems, right? And so you have this wave of narcissism that's hit us. There was a book written called The Narcissism Epidemic. And this professor, who's been brilliant with this stuff, had students take the Narcissistic Personality Inventory Test and found that between 1979, going back to the beginning of the self-esteem movement, and 2006, that narcissism rates among college students rose by more than 30%. That's what self-esteem has got us. And we've become a nation plagued by pride and superiority issues and anger and hatred and even straight up diagnosed narcissism. And so here's the test, the Narcissistic Personality Inventory Test. Asks things like this. Do you agree or not with the following statement? And these people, imagine having a disagreement with someone who affirms all this. I can live my life any way I want to. If I ruled the world, it would be a better place. A biography should be written about me. I am an extraordinary person. I am more capable than other people. These people really esteem themselves, right? And there's two types of narcissists. There's the one that probably comes to your mind that's the grandiose narcissist that walks around and says, I'm smarter than you, and I'm better looking than you, and if the world were under my authority, it would be way better. And they're quick to blame others. They exploit people without remorse. But then there's a different type of narcissist that has really come to the forefront and since the self-esteem movement, and it's called a vulnerable narcissist. And the problem is the same, right? I can't take my eyes off of me, like narcissist. Looking into the puddle, he sees himself, oh, I can't take my eyes off of him. The grandiose narcissist says, because I'm so beautiful, but the vulnerable narcissist is hypersensitive and easily hurt, feels frequently victimized, is introverted and reserved and devastated by failure or rejection and obsessed with public perception. So let me summarize. The grandiose narcissist is over here going, everybody in this room is thinking about me. The vulnerable narcissist is over here going, everyone in this room is thinking about me. They're both utterly self-obsessed. And it's enslaving. A 2007 study done by Columbia University found that students who are praised excessively are far less likely to try new things because of their fear of failure. Does that make sense to you? If you've been told you're number one all your life, can you imagine how terrifying it is to put the title up for grabs? Oh my God, but what if they find out I'm a fraud? What if they find out I'm not really the best? What if they find out that all this praise that they've been heaping on me my whole life is untrue? What if they find me out? And so, we offer praise for performance before it's even performed, and that will just absolutely shut you down. Like if I told you, my dad tells the funniest jokes, you're going to laugh like crazy. Dad, come tell a joke. Right? Like, no way. You've already set me up for failure by saying I'm the best, by praising me before I've even had a shot. Now the only thing I can do is disappoint. I'm not even going to try. And so we see a generation that's like this. Psychologists noted that the children have been conditioned to believe that they are valued based on their performance. And they don't want the accolades to go away by proving them wrong. You know, studies show that kids who aced tests, there was a great study done where kids took tests, and they took half the students who aced the test, and they came over here and said to them, you got the highest grades in the class. I'm so proud of you. Because of your score, you're amazing. Good job. And then they took the other half of the kids over here who aced the test and said, you worked so hard. You studied so hard. You invested so hard. And they praised the process rather than the result. In all future tests, this group destroyed this group in performance. Because now this group is terrified Oh, what if I lose that? What if I don't get the highest grade? Where this group over here was praised for the effort, the process. Well, I can do that. I can give my best every time, regardless of the outcome. They took a group of pottery students at college. This one was so fascinating to me. They took half of the class and they said, okay, this semester, you're going to be graded on one piece of pottery, and you're going to spend the entire semester learning techniques, reading books, watching YouTube videos, doing all of that. And at the end of the semester, on the final day, you're going to make a vase, you're going to put it in the kiln, and you're going to be graded. Your entire grade is on the quality of this one item. They take the other half of the students and they put them in and they say, you're going to be graded on how much pottery you produce. Quality doesn't matter, just get as much of it done as you can, and at the end of the semester, you're going to be graded on how much you produce. Secretly, the professors were taking this pottery and comparing it to the last piece of pottery that each of these students produced. Who do you think produced the better pottery? The ones who weren't afraid of failure and had spent a whole semester learning how to fail. Learning what not to do when you make pottery, making mistakes, getting better. This is the kind of generation we're training. Don't make mistakes. You're not allowed to make mistakes. There was a study that was done in one of the Ivy League institutions, and they found that the number one indicator of success was not your income. It wasn't your GPA, your SAT scores, your ACT scores, your race, your gender, none of that. Your number one indicator of success was how you measured on what they called the grit index. Can you pick yourself up after failure and keep going on without it crushing you? Grit. My kids hear grit all the time, right, kids? They're annoyed with me about it, actually. But grit, learning how to fail and keeping with it, not letting failure decimate you. And the Bible comes with these stories. Like the most famous parable in the scriptures is the parable of the prodigal son. You know the story, right? You have a young guy and his older brother, and they're living in a home, and both of them don't really like the way things are going under dad. But the younger brother's brazen, and he comes to dad, and he's like, you know what, like I'm not really liking your leadership in this home, and I would like to try things my own way, to be quite frank. Like, so what do you say you just divide up the inheritance, give me all my money now, and I can be done with you? Now, in the Kastensmidt house, I can tell you that would be a very short conversation. But I want you to think about this. In the parable, what does the father do? Okay. Totally heartbroken. Devastated that his kid basically says, I want nothing to do with you. And the dad, and in the parable, who's the dad? The dad is compared to God the Father. Like, whoa, what do you mean? Like, and he says, okay, here, go. And the younger brother runs off to the far country and spends it on wild living, and eventually he's bankrupt and broke and living in the mud of pigs and eating what the pigs are eating. And he comes to his senses and he's like, man, if only I had realized how good it was back when I was at home with dad. And he develops the apology speech, and he's thinking like, I've been crushed, like everything I thought I was is not true. And he takes the long walk home, and he comes, and when dad sees him from a distance, what is dad doing? He's on the rooftop waiting for the son to come home. He sprints out to him and embraces him, and he's like, get the best robe and the best shoes and restore him. Get the ring, put it on his finger. We're restoring this kid, and it is a salvation moment for the younger son while the older brother is off in the fields going, I never get treated like that, right? It's a redemption story for the prodigal. What's the difference between the two? Failure. One came to realize that I'm not the center of the universe, that left to myself, I'm going to fail. And the father was brilliant enough and loved his son enough to let him fail while he was still going to be there to pick the kid up, to lift him up. And to teach him, how do you recover from failure? How do you learn resiliency? Where is your real identity? Okay, now that you're restored, you're mine. But the brilliance of this story is the father let him fail. And when the son failed and learned from his shortcomings, you notice the father, he's not there to go, well, I'm really ashamed in you and your performance and what you've done. And no. The son's learned that. The father's there to restore him and to show him that there is nothing come hell or high water that could break his love. He was always there to restore him. You know, when Caleb was in 5th grade, I got his permission to share this. But when Caleb was in 5th grade, we were watching TV and some like nonsense show, mental mashed potatoes, just noise going on. And all of a sudden, from across the room, it's just me and him. And he says, hey, Dad, what's up, Caleb? I feel like I'm going to be a failure in life. TV off, bam. Like, whoa, what? Like 5th grade, why are you even thinking about this stuff? And he's like, I just don't feel like I'm going to be able to succeed like everyone else. And that was devastating for a dad to hear about a son. And it was like, Caleb, whoa. I want you define for me. What do you mean you're not going to be a success? How do you define success? And as a 5th grader, he starts talking and you kind of see, okay, you're defining success the way the world is defining success. You're going to go off, you want to get into the good college, you want to get the good job, you want to make a lot of money, you want to get married and have kids, and you're looking at the way that the world has described success, and it's shaking you to your core, and you don't know if you can achieve it. Let me change the subject, Caleb. If Jesus were sitting in this room and he was telling you how to define success, what do you think he'd say to you right now, Caleb? And then the conversation shifted. Because Jesus has told us how you define a successful life. You remember the people come to him and they're like, what is the greatest commandment? What's the most important thing that all human beings need to do in this life? And Jesus says, you want to know what the most important thing you can do with your life is? Well, here it is. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. And the second greatest commandment's a lot like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. Why is that the case? Because all the things that this world is coming to this next generation saying, this is what's important. It's the job, and it's the college, and it's the grades, and it's this and this. All that stuff is going to get sucked away at the grave. All of it is rendered utterly meaningless for eternity at the grave. All the money, all the accolades, all the job titles, everything gone at the grave. And Jesus is saying, if you want to do something and make success out of your life, devote your life to the things that matter for eternity, which is what? Love the Lord your God with everything you got. That is a relationship that will never be stripped away from you. And oh, by the way, love your neighbor as yourself, because you're talking and you're surrounded by a bunch of immortal creatures that are going somewhere forever. And so get the money and use it to love your neighbor. Use your talents, but devote them to glorifying God, because this is the eternal stuff. And I said, Caleb, set this pressure aside for a moment and look at where you're doing over here. Like, you love God with everything you got, bud. You love your classmates like crazy. In the ways that matter eternally, you're a success already, bud. Keep your eyes fixed on what God has for you, and don't let your heart be overrun with the fear of losing stuff that in the eternal scheme of things is nowhere near as important. And we are training up a generation that's terrified of failure, partly because they have a terrible definition of what success is. And we just pour gasoline on it. Paul had people who came to him and said, you shouldn't be an apostle, you shouldn't be this. And in the liberty of the gospel, I love what he says to them. He says, I care very little if I'm judged by you. Yes. Or any human court. Indeed, I do not even judge myself. Whoa. How can you do that? My conscience is clear, but that doesn't make me innocent. Yeah, I know I'm flawed. But you see, the Lord judges me. And in the courts of heaven, There has been a verdict that has been rendered over every single person who finds themselves in Christ. And that verdict is, you are not just innocent. You are radiating in the righteousness of Christ, who went to a cross to take all of your failures and to give you all of his righteousness, so that in the Son of God and the sight of God, you are his adopted sons and daughters. Let all of the world's pressures melt away and grab hold of the only verdict that truly matters. You are righteous, and you are so precious in my sight that I would give my life for you. Our kids need to hear that, because they are not hearing it from this world. And when they hear it, they are free. Caleb, after that conversation, was walking on sunshine. I'll close with this statement. A.W. Tozer said, "The meek man is not a human mouse afflicted with a sense of his own inferiority. Oh, I'm so bad. Rather, he may be in his moral life as bold as a lion or as strong as Samson, but he has stopped being fooled about himself. He has accepted God's estimate of his own life. He knows he is as weak and helpless as God has declared him to be. But paradoxically, he knows at the same time that he is, in the sight of God, of more importance than angels." That's good medicine. That's what our kids need to hear. That's what this generation needs. That's what I need. And it's what you need. And we need to be bold, as courageous, bold as lions, as courageous and strong as Samson, to go out into a world and say, break those chains and come to Jesus. Let him free you of this stuff. Amen? Father, Lord, I thank you so much for who you are. I thank you that you look at us, and before we even get a chance to try to prove ourselves, you tell us, no, you're a mess. You know us, and that's liberating. And yet, while you diagnose us correctly, you also tell us that we are so valuable that we can't even begin to imagine how precious we are in your sight. Lord, I pray for this generation and the generations to come, Lord, that you would help them to recognize just how precious they are, that as parents, we would lift up that which is true to our children, that they would get a good sense of what real success is, that we would help them learn how to fail, learn resiliency and grit, and that this next generation would catch fire for the gospel and do great things to bring bright, shining lights into a nation that is really suffering under darkness these days. Help us to be a part of it. Help us to be your ambassadors here for the sake of all future generations to come. We pray in Christ's name. Amen.